Apple Watches have consistently been amongst the best watches when it comes to accurately tracking your health and sports. But how does the Apple Watch Series 8 stack up against the competition after 5 months of testing? In this video, I'll be sharing a scientific review of the Apple Watch 8 based on a lot of data. Now, over these past few months, I've thoroughly tested the Apple Watch Series 8, collecting data from 139 workouts, 60 nights of sleep, 84 GPS tests, and 2 tests in a low oxygen environment to give you a comprehensive look at the sports and health tracking capabilities of the Apple Watch Series 8. Now, on this channel, we don't focus on features and looks. Instead, we'll be focusing on what really matters to many of you, the accuracy and reliability of the measurements of the Apple Watch Series 8. Now, I'll be systematically analyzing all the data I collected. Specifically, I'll compare 60 nights of sleep data from the Apple Watch to that of an EEG device that can actually measure my brainwaves. And we'll also compare the heart rate measurements of the Apple Watch to an ECG device. Next, we'll be checking if the GPS signals are consistent, and we'll also test the Apple Watch in a low oxygen environment. Now, this information should help you determine whether the health tracking features of the Apple Watch Series 8 are suitable for your own personal needs. Now, it is worth mentioning that while the Apple Watch 8 lived up to my expectations in many ways, there are a few crucial aspects where it actually showed some problems that I haven't covered in my earlier videos. I was now able to unravel these issues because I updated the computer code I used in my analysis, allowing me to better judge the performance of the Apple Watch Series 8. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into this scientific review of the Apple Watch. Hello everyone, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you know that I don't like listing the specifications of watches as these are readily available on the website of the manufacturer. Instead, we'll be focusing on actual data I collected with the Apple Watch Series 8. However, before showing you the results, I did briefly want to mention some of the updates that the Apple Watch Series 8 has gotten over the last few months in about 30 seconds. Now, first of all, you can now extend the battery life of the Apple Watch during outdoor walking, running and hiking workouts by reducing the frequency of the heart rate and GPS readings. Second, outdoor running workout now automatically detects when you arrive at a running track and also provides some track-specific metrics, at least in the US. And the final thing I wanted to mention is that race route now lets you compete against your previous performance in outdoor run, outdoor cycle and outdoor wheelchair workouts. However, let's not delay the actual testing of the Apple Watch 8 any further, and I want to start off with the heart rate tracking accuracy, since this is probably the most important feature for many of you using the Apple Watch Series 8. To test that, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the Apple Watch 8 against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. And we'll start by looking at one of the easiest types of exercises for a watch to track, cycling indoors. And we'll look at a total of 28 interval spinning sessions. Now, this involves very little movement or tension on my arms and will therefore produce less noise. And here you can see an overview of that accuracy over those rides. Each dot here is a single heart rate measurement with on the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap and on the vertical axis the value according to the Apple Watch. Now, the closer the points are to this blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots that there are. Now, as you can see, there's actually a great agreement between the Apple Watch 8 and the ECG chest strap as most points are very close or on the blue line. Now, to quantify this agreement, I'll use a correlation, which is this R value up here. In this case, the correlation is 1.00 when we round it to 2 decimal points. Now, since the correlation cannot be higher than 1, a rounded correlation of 1.00 is extremely good. And we can see that even more intuitively when we look at the individual training sessions. And you can see one example right here. Along the horizontal axis, we have the time, and my heart rate is along the vertical axis. In blue-green, I plotted my heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red is my heart rate according to the Watch 8. As you can see, the two lines overlap very well. So well, in fact, that you can almost not see the red line at all, and this is the line representing the Apple Watch Series 8. And that is what we see for almost all indoor cycling sessions, like this one right here as well, where the overlap is almost perfect with the ECG chest strap. And as I said, this is true for basically all sessions, like this one right here as well. But there was one single session that showed some deviations. And that is this session right here. And this is where the new computer code I wrote already shows some of its improvements. And you can actually see two issues here. First of all, you can see that at the peaks of my heart rate, the Apple Watch sometimes measured a slightly too high heart rate. You can see that right here, here, and here. Sometimes it even gets close to 180 beats per minute, which is not likely for me during this type of exercise. And the second issue is that there were 2 moments where it lost the signal for a bit. There's one major segment right here in the beginning where you see there's just a line but no points, meaning that the watch did not have a signal. And you can also see in the beginning of this interval right here that it lost the signal for a while. Now in the figures I used to show in my videos, I showed you the measurements of both the ECG device and the Apple Watch if both had a signal. However, now I actually plot both, regardless if just one had a signal, and this allows us to detect when the watch loses a signal, as we can see right here and right here. However, overall, this is still looking very good. Next, let's put this into perspective by comparing it to about 60 other watches I've tested over the last 2 years. That overview is displayed right here. Now the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric I'll use for this, and that is displayed along the horizontal axis. We want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. And on the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best, so the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. Now here I marked the Apple Watch 8 in red, and as you can see, the Watch 8 has the best score out of any of the devices I've tested over the last years. However, it's honestly a bit difficult to see because of the number of watches in this plot, so let's zoom in a bit. And here I show the best devices I ever tested, in this case all devices with a correlation of 0.9 or higher. Now as you can see, the Apple Watch 8 has the highest score, but it's basically similar to all other recent Apple Watches. There will be some random variation in my testing, which means that there will be some error margins we need to take into account. I honestly expect that the differences in performance between the different Apple Watches is in this case close to or smaller than the error margins of my testing. So we cannot really say if any Apple Watch is really doing any better or worse. However, all of them are doing really well regardless. So far, the Apple Watch 8 has demonstrated its capabilities tracking a relatively simple workout. But how does it perform in a more challenging type of exercise, such as outdoor cycling? Now, this type of workout can prove to be more difficult for watches to accurately track heart rate readings, as they tend to move around a lot more on the wrist. To put the Apple Watch 8 to the test, I went for a total of 70 bike rides to see how it would fare under these conditions. This new plot shows the correlation between the Apple Watch 8 and the ECG chest strap, but now for cycling outdoors. Now, the overall agreement remains very good, with all data points very close to the blue line. However, you can see there is a slight increase in the distance between the points and the line, and the correlation coefficient also has decreased a bit, now to 0.98, which is honestly still a very high value. So overall, at least based on this, I would still conclude that the Apple Watch 8 is performing very well for cycling outdoors. However, as we will see when looking at the individual bike rides, the new code I wrote again brings some issues to light that we didn't see before. But I'll get to that in a second, since for most rides the agreement is actually still really good. As you can see right here, for instance, the red line representing the Apple Watch 8 is super close to the blue line of the ECG chest strap. There are some minor deviations, but these are quite minor, and there's also a bit of missing data here in the beginning, but overall it's not too bad. And this is actually what we see for most outdoor cycling examples. The heart rate measured by the Apple Watch 8 is very close to the heart rate measured by the ECG chest strap, though there are some minor deviations, as you can see right here, for instance. However, due to the new data visualization I used, we can see that there are some moments where the Apple Watch lost a signal for a while, as you can see especially here in the beginning, and also some later moments like right here, and right here. Again, you can see this since there are straight red lines there with no points on it, meaning that there was no measurements taken in this interval. Now, looking at all of the recordings I took with the Apple Watch Series 8, I would say that about 10% of the outdoor cycling rides showed issues similar to this. So this is still relatively minor, but there were a few rides that showed bigger issues. And one example of a bigger issue is this ride right here, where in the beginning there's quite some missing data, as you see a lot of straight lines right here. And this ride right here was even worse, with the first third of the ride having a lot of missing data, as you can see a lot of straight lines right here. Now, looking at all the data, I would say that about 5% of the ride showed larger issues like this one right here. So overall, 85% of the rides have no to few issues, 10% have minor issues, and 5% have larger issues like this one right here. So generally, this is still not that bad. However, we can again put this into perspective by comparing it to many of the other watches I've tested over the last years. Now, similar to before, we'll use the correlation with the ECG chest strap as the value on the horizontal axis, and the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. And as you can see, the Apple Watch Series 8, again marked in red, is really amongst the best devices when it comes to heart rate tracking for cycling outside. Similar to before, all Apple Watches perform roughly the same, with the Apple Watch Ultra, Apple Watch Series 7 and Apple Watch SE showing similar performance, which we can see even better if we zoom in a bit. Only Huawei watches come close to this performance, as you can see right here, but overall I would say Apple Watches are still in a league of their own. So the Apple Watch 8 is doing really well, except for these moments where it lost its signal. I should note though that the correlation value does not take into account these missing values, so this is something that you should keep in mind and separately judge if this is an issue for you. Still, the Apple Watch Series 8, like basically all Apple Watches, does really well. However, surprisingly, there's one exercise where not all Apple Watches perform the same, and this is outdoor running. I'll show you how the Apple Watch Series 8 performed while running, but I'll also compare this to the more expensive Apple Watch Ultra. Although both were released simultaneously and they share the same sensor, you'll see that they don't perform the same. Now here you can see one outdoor run I did with the Apple Watch Series 8. You do see there are some minor deviations between the ECG chest strap and the Apple Watch, but overall this is actually looking quite good. And this is what we see for many of the runs, like this one right here for instance. Though there is some minor deviation, especially at the peaks of my heart rate, overall this looks quite good for the Apple Watch 8. However, during the same run, I also wore the Apple Watch Ultra, which is displayed right here. And as you can see, this actually did a lot worse. Especially at the peaks of my heart rate, it tended to overestimate my actual heart rate. So if we go back now to the Series 8 for the same run, we see a much better match than we see here for the Apple Watch Ultra. And we can see the same thing for this example run right here, where the Apple Watch 8 is doing quite well. There's a bit of missing data here and a tiny bit of deviation, but overall it's looking quite good. However, for the same run, the Apple Watch right here did not do quite as well, showing missing data and also overestimation of my heart rate. However, almost all of the runs with the Apple Watch 8 looked quite good. There was a single run that had some issues, and that's this one right here. So this is the Apple Watch 8 in red, and you can see that there is some deviation between the Apple Watch 8 and the ECG chest strap. The Apple Watch 8 also tended to overestimate my heart rate sometimes. However, for the Apple Watch 8, this was the exception rather than the rule, whereas the Apple Watch Ultra consistently showed some issues. Now check out my recent video on the Apple Watch Ultra if you want to know more about the most expensive Apple Watch ever made. So the Apple Watch Series 8 actually outperformed the more expensive Ultra despite having the same sensor. Now this could be due to two potential reasons. First of all, the Ultra is notably heavier than the Series 8, causing it to potentially move around more on the wrist and creating a less accurate signal. Now, I think that this is likely the primary factor contributing to the Ultra's weaker performance, but another possibility is that the strap I used for the Ultra, in this case the Alpine Loop, may not fit as well as the Velcro strap I used for the Apple Watch Series 8, even though I did try to wear both quite tightly. Ultimately, the weight and the fit of these two watches may have impacted their performance levels. However, let's also take a look at another exercise that is quite hard for many smartwatches, namely weightlifting. As I mentioned previously, this is one of the more difficult exercises because of the increased tension on my wrist and on my arm, making it much harder for many watches to get a clean heart rate signal. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. Of course, you would also make me really happy and it would help my efforts if you subscribe to this YouTube channel. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance during weightlifting, which I tested during a total of 22 training sessions. Now here we can see an overview of that accuracy similar to what we were looking at before. The performance of the Apple Watch 8 appears to be similar to what I had during cycling outside based on this analysis at least, since we see roughly the same amount of points close to the blue line. And we can also see that the correlation is similar at 0.98, which is actually a very respectable value for weightlifting. However, this doesn't tell us the full story, which we actually can get if we look at the individual training sessions. And here we have the first example session. Now this is actually a session where the Apple Watch performed quite good. It follows along nicely with the chest strap and it doesn't have major gaps in the data. Unfortunately, there were also some sessions that showed issues with missing data, like this one right here. You can see here that for the first part of my training session, the Apple Watch 8 actually had problems tracking the peaks in my heart rate. Now it seems that during these sets, the tension on my arms was so big that the Apple Watch wasn't really able to track my heart rate at all. However, the second half of the session isn't quite as bad, and there were even some worse sessions like this one right here, where I had a lot of missing data. I would say that this is one of the worst examples I could find in all of my data. Now, looking at all the data at an overview, I would say that most sessions are a mix with some peaks being detected and some having a bit of missing data. And I would say this training session right here is a typical example of what that looked like. But there were also some training sessions that are actually quite good, like this one right here, where the Apple Watch was able to pick up on most of the peaks in my heart rate. Now we can again put this into perspective by comparing it to many of the other watches I've tested in the past. And you can see those results in this overview right here. Again, the more to the top right, the better the consistency with the ECG chest strap. And as you can see, relative to other watches, the Apple Watch 8 marked in red is doing really well, which we can see even more clearly if we zoom into the best performing watches. We can again see that the Apple Watch 8 is amongst the top performing watches together with the Apple Watch Series 6 and 7, the Apple Watch Ultra and the new 2022 Apple Watch SE. Though I again have to mention that these correlations do not take into account the missing peaks in my heart rate that the Apple Watch 8 fails to detect. So this means that when it is able to measure a heart rate, the Apple Watch 8 is really one of the most accurate devices out there, but especially for weightlifting, there will be some missing data. However, almost all devices really struggle with this, so even for weightlifting, the Apple Watch 8 is still one of the best devices out there. I've recently begun practicing yoga, and I found that the Apple Watch is a reliable tool to track my heart rate. The reason I want to show you this is because my heart rate remains quite consistent throughout my yoga sessions, so there's little room for error for the Apple Watch. Now, I won't go into great detail, but I would like to show you a couple of examples to illustrate this. Now, this is the first yoga session I want to show you, and as you can see, there isn't too much variation in my heart rate, and most of the time my heart rate was between roughly 90 and 110 BPM, and even within this range, the Apple Watch 8 was generally still pretty consistent with the ECG chest strap. And we can see the same thing for this second example session right here. The Apple Watch 8 generally follows along quite nicely with the chest strap, even in this very narrow heart rate range. So overall, the Apple Watch 8 is mostly performing as we expected, with a few exceptions. First of all, we see that there are some moments where it loses the heart rate signal for a while. This is especially true on weightlifting, but also sometimes when cycling outside. Second, it did show some minor issues when running as well, but surprisingly, the more expensive Apple Watch Ultra showed much more significant issues, and I think this is likely due to the added weight of the Ultra. However, even though there are some moments of missing data, when the Apple Watch Series 8 does detect the heart rate, it is very accurate. Therefore, overall, I'd give the heart rate tracking accuracy of the Apple Watch Series 8 4.5 out of 5 stars. But let's now move on to something that Apple introduced just before the launch of the Apple Watch Series 8 and immediately became the market leader at, namely sleep stage tracking. Now, before that time, Apple Watches could only track when you were awake or asleep, but they didn't provide any details. However, since that time, the sleep stage algorithm has been updated to also include the sleep stages. So those are deep sleep, REM sleep, and light sleep. Now, for some reason, Apple uses the term core sleep instead of light sleep. Now, I suspect that this is for marketing purposes because light sleep likely sounds like a bad thing, at least if you're not familiar with sleep stages, whereas core sleep sounds much better. Now, to test the sleep stage tracking accuracy of the Apple Watch Series 8, I compared it against an EEG device during a total of 60 nights. Specifically to check if the Apple Watch 8 can detect my sleep stages, I'll compare it to an EEG device called the Dream 2 that can actually measure my brainwaves and has been shown to be relatively reliable at sleep stage tracking. And here I show an overview of the sleep test results. Now, for getting an overall impression of how well the Apple Watch 8 performs, the Dream 2 should likely be good enough. However, this is not perfect itself, and the gold standard would be polysomnography, which I can likely try on the Apple Watch 8 in a few weeks. Now, on top here are the sleep stages as recorded by the EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Apple Watch 8. Now, we want to see how close the predictions of the Apple Watch are to those of the EEG device. And each column sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 was predicted as a sleep stage by the Apple Watch Series 8. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. First of all, we see that about 82% of what was deep sleep according to the EEG device was also deep sleep according to the Apple Watch, which is actually pretty good. And when deep sleep according to the EEG device was predicted differently by the Apple Watch, it was predicted as light sleep at about 17%. And we can see that based on the individual nights. On top here we have the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 EEG headband with the clock time along the horizontal axis and the sleep stages on the vertical axis. On the bottom you have a similar plot, but now for the Apple Watch 8. And I've highlighted all the EEG recorded deep sleep in purple right here. Now for this night, we can indeed see that the deep sleep detected by the EEG headband and the deep sleep detected by the Apple Watch 8 show pretty good agreement. However, the Apple Watch does tend to detect some extra deep sleep. So basically all of the deep sleep detected by the EEG device is also detected by the Apple Watch, but as you can see, the Apple Watch detected a bit more deep sleep. This was actually a night where I woke up quite a bit. However, if we look at this night where I didn't wake up as much, we see an even better agreement between the deep sleep detection of the EEG headband and the Apple Watch Series 8. And for this third example night, we also see a good deep sleep agreement, though interestingly in this case it's the Apple Watch detecting less deep sleep than the EEG device. However, still in most cases it's the other way around. Light sleep agreement with the EEG device is similar to what we saw for deep sleep at about 83%. And I have to say 83% is quite good and I'm not disappointed by this. If it was predicted differently, it was mostly predicted as being deep sleep and awake time by the Apple Watch 8. But still, overall, this is pretty good. Now, similar to what we saw for the Apple Watch Ultra in one of my last videos, REM sleep prediction is actually where the Apple Watch 8 deviates most from the EEG device. About 62% of what the EEG device detected as being REM sleep was also detected as REM sleep by the Apple Watch 8, and almost all the remaining part was detected as light sleep at about 33%. And we can see that clearly based on the individual nights as well. So this is a similar overview plot to before, but now with the REM sleep as measured by the EEG device marked in red. Again, we see a generally pretty good agreement. The rough REM sleep segments agree very well between the EEG headband and the Apple Watch Series 8. Only near the end here do we see a segment where there's disagreement between the Apple Watch and the EEG headband. In this case, the EEG headband detected an extra segment compared to the Apple Watch. And this is roughly the general pattern we see for most nights, where most of the rough REM sleep segments agree between the Apple Watch and the EEG device, but the exact duration of the segments differs. In this case, we see that only the first short REM sleep segment of the EEG device is not detected by the Apple Watch Series 8, but overall it agrees very well. And this also means that for many nights you will be able to see your sleep cycles based on just the data from the Apple Watch. Now you go through roughly 4 to 6 sleep cycles each night, each one starting with light sleep and deep sleep, which is marked in blue, and each one ending in REM sleep, marked here in red. And as you can see, I likely had 1, 2, 3, 4, or maybe 5 complete sleep cycles this night. And we're able to see all of them except for the first one based on just the data from the Apple Watch. And this is actually something that most watches struggle with, so this is really good. And we mostly see the same thing for this example night right here, where only the last segment now is not visible, but there's a generally good agreement. And again, we see the same thing for this final example right here. So overall, this is not looking too bad. Now, similar to deep sleep and light sleep, time spent awake also agreed very well between the Apple Watch 8 and the EEG device, with about 82% of what the EEG device detected as being awake time also detected by the Apple Watch 8. If they did disagree, the Apple Watch 8 mostly detected this as being light sleep. And as I've mentioned before, this makes some sense as light sleep is the closest sleep stage to being awake. Now, the Apple Watch actually seems to be quite consistent with the EEG device, particularly during longer wakefulness periods, as you can see by the EEG recorded awake moments highlighted in green for this particular night right here. Although the more brief awake moments do not always match, as you can see right here, but also right here, the long awake moments show a good agreement between the EEG device and the Apple Watch 8, which we can also see very well for this example night, where there's a generally very good agreement between the awake moments detected by the Apple Watch Series 8 and the EEG device. So this is actually looking quite good. But to put these results into context, we can compare the performance of the Apple Watch 8 to 44 other watches I've tested in the past. Now this graph shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with the EEG device. Along the horizontal axis we have the average agreement over the 4 individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. So the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. As you can see, the devices with the best agreement so far are different Apple Watches. In this case, the Apple Watch Series 7, the Apple Watch SE 2022 and the Apple Watch Ultra. Other good devices include different Fitbits, Whoop straps, the Google Pixel Watch, Google Nest Hub 2 and the Withings Sleep Analyzer, though these are not quite as good as the Apple Watches. If we now plot the Apple Watch Series 8 in the same plot, which are marked here in red, we see it's very similar in performance to all of the other Apple Watches I've tested. The overall agreement here along the horizontal axis is nearly the same for the Apple Watch Ultra, Apple Watch 7 and Apple Watch 8. Now these are actually the Apple Watches for which I collected most nights of data, making their estimation most reliable. The fact that they're so similar makes me suspect that they all use the same algorithm and are equally reliable. The Apple Watch SE in this case shows slightly better agreement, but I also have the least amount of data for this watch, so I think it's likely random variation. So overall, the sleep stage tracking of the Apple Watch 8 seems to be really good, but I suspect all Apple Watches perform about the same. But since there's no device that has performed better in my testing, Overall, I'd give the sleep stage tracking of the Apple Watch 8 5 out of 5 stars. But let's now move on to another important feature of the Apple Watch 8, the location or GPS tracking. To test that, I tracked my route during a total of 10 bike rides while I was cycling to and from work, and I wanted to test two things. One, how long does it take for the watch to get a GPS signal? And two, how well the GPS signals overlap when cycling the same route several times. I actually collected data for more than 80 rides, but here I just show you the most recent rides, recorded within the last few weeks with the most recent public firmware available at the time. Now here you can see the results for 5 times I cycled to work, and I started each activity the moment I was ready to leave, and I didn't give the watch any extra time to acquire the signal. And these green markers right here indicate the moment that it connected the GPS signal, and I always started my ride from this corner right here. Now as you can see, it connected almost instantly in most cases and also pretty accurately, which is really good. Almost no other watch besides Apple Watches are that fast and accurate in getting that initial GPS signal. Now at the start, if we zoom out, we do see that there's some variation, so it needs some time to acquire a more precise signal. And as I cycle on, there are some deviations between the signals, but they do get better over time. Especially right here, we see the signals get to be quite consistent. And as I continue cycling, I would say that the signal quality notably improves compared to the beginning, with the signals overlapping really well for a large part of the journey, as you can see right here. Now you can see that one ride right here shows a bit of deviation from the others, but it quickly comes back to the other signals again right here. And if we go a bit further, we see that near these turns the signals overlap quite well, but if we zoom in, we also see that the signals appear to be a bit smoothed out, so a bit rounder than they would actually be, so there might be some smoothing going on by Apple. But after that segment, I would say that the signals overlap quite well. There are some moments with a bit more deviation, but overall the Apple Watch is doing pretty okay. So there is a bit more deviation near the end here, and out of all the watches I've tested, only Garmin seems to consistently outperform Apple Watches, but it's not by that big a margin. And we see more or less the same thing for cycling back from work. As you can see, the signals are acquired really quickly again, and in the beginning the signals do show a bit of deviation, but then as I cycle on, the quality gets a lot better and the signals overlap really well. Overall, I would say all these 5 rides look really good and they overlap quite well, so the GPS performance of the Apple Watch is not bad at all, at least based on this testing. Though there are some moments with some minor deviation, as you can see right here for instance, but also right here one of the signals deviates a bit. But as I said, overall, I'm not disappointed with the performance of the Apple Watch 8. So the GPS tracking performance of the Apple Watch 8 seems to be quite good. It locks onto my signal really fast and accurately, and it also tracks my routes quite consistently, though it does need a bit of time to get the best quality out of the signal. Therefore, overall, I'd give the GPS tracking 4 to maybe even 4.5 out of 5 stars. As I also mentioned in my Apple Watch Ultra video, only Garmin seems to do consistently better out of all the brands and watches I've tested in terms of GPS tracking. But let's now move on to a feature that became more important as the COVID pandemic started, namely measuring your oxygen saturation, or in other words, SpO2. To test the oxygen saturation measurement, I wanted to see 1, if the Apple Watch 8 can detect a low oxygen saturation when it is supposed to, and if it ever detects a low oxygen saturation when it's not supposed to. To evaluate this, I performed 2 tests. First of all, I took dozens of measurements at ground level where the watch is supposed to detect a normal oxygen saturation level. Now when testing it, I systematically swapped the watch between both of my wrists, and this way I hope to get a good representation of the measurements it can take. At ground level, my oxygen saturation should be in my normal range, which is generally between 97 and 100% and should not fall below roughly 95%. However, when the effective oxygen concentration is much lower, as it is for instance in a low air pressure environment, my oxygen saturation can drop below 90%. Now the same thing can happen when you have certain medical conditions like sleep apnea or a respiratory infection. To test this ability, I took the Apple Watch 8 with me on 2 airplane flights, where the air pressure in the cabin is much lower, thereby reducing my oxygen saturation. Let's start with the measurements I took at ground level. So on the left we have all the measurements taken with the Apple Watch Series 8, and on the right the matching measurements taken with a finger pulse oximeter, which is especially designed for measuring oxygen saturation. Along the vertical axis are the SpO2 values, and each dot represents a single measurement. As you can see, most of the measurements taken with the Apple Watch Series 8 were in my normal range, but still 9 times it recorded an SpO2 value below 95%. Now this isn't bad, but also not great, since we saw that in my test with the Apple Watch Ultra only one measurement was this low. And we can see that even more clearly if we display these results as a histogram, with again the Apple Watch in red and the finger pulse oximeter in blue. Now in this case, the SpO2 values are along the horizontal axis, and the higher the bar, the more often this value was recorded. As you can see, indeed the Apple Watch 8 generally recorded lower values than the finger pulse oximeter, but luckily most of them are still in my normal range. So at ground level, the Apple Watch 8 does take some low measurements sometimes, though not extremely low. However, it's probably more important to know if the Apple Watch 8 can detect a lowered oxygen saturation when it is supposed to. To test this, I took the Apple Watch Series 8 with me on 2 airplane flights. Now an airplane is actually a low pressure environment, which should lead to a lowered oxygen saturation in my blood. Now in the plane, the air pressure in the cabin is decreased during the flight, which effectively lowers the oxygen concentration, meaning less oxygen is available when I breathe, which in turn lowers the oxygen content of my red blood cells. Now in pink here I plotted how my oxygen saturation changed during a flight as measured using my dedicated finger pulse oximeter. As you can see, my SpO2 started out normal, then as the plane ascended my oxygen saturation decreased. It stayed low during the flight, then as we descended it increased again and got back to normal levels. And here you can see the measurements of the Apple Watch 8 in green dots. Now it looks like it's pretty accurate and matches up quite well with the finger pulse oximeter. Now we see it is a little bit noisy, but it does dip below 94% or lower SpO2 values during the flight, and before takeoff and after landing the values are mostly 95% or higher, so this is a good result. Now just to give it a bit of perspective, here on the left in red are the measurements taken with the Apple Watch 8 at ground level. And as you can see during the flight, the values did tend to be lower than those measured at ground level. Now to make sure that the results were consistent, I took the watch with me on a second flight, which you can see right here. Again in pink we can see the measurements taken by the reference device, and if we now add the measurements taken with the Apple Watch, we see there's an even better agreement than for the other flight. The SpO2 values of the Apple Watch 8 here in green and the finger pulse oximeter in pink overlap almost perfectly in this case, so this is looking really good. So overall, I would say that the SpO2 measurements of the Apple Watch 8 are quite good. It does sometimes detect false positive low values, but in flight it can mostly detect my lowered oxygen saturation patterns correctly. Therefore overall, based on the testing I've done so far, I'd give the SpO2 measurements of the Apple Watch Series 8 4 out of 5 stars. Now there's one often overlooked functionality of the Apple Watch 8 I want to briefly address, namely the new skin temperature sensor. Now I don't think the sensor will be used as intensively by most people, at least not compared to all of the other functionalities we discussed, but it might prove to be sporadically useful for many of you. Now most of my subscribers are actually men, and for you the most important implication of this new sensor is that it might be able to detect when you have a fever. Now I wasn't able to test this yet for the Apple Watch Series 8, but I did happen to be wearing my Apple Watch Ultra when I caught COVID a few weeks ago. The Ultra has the same sensor as the Apple Watch Series 8, so I think it might be interesting to briefly share these results. And here you can see how two of the measurements changed when I got infected. Let's first focus on my temperature, which you can see here on top with degrees Celsius on the left and degrees Fahrenheit on the right. So after symptom onset, which is displayed here in blue, my temperature actually increased, and just before I had a minor fever during the day, my skin temperature was also at its highest during the night, though not drastically so. However, the Apple Watch was at least able to show a moderate increase right here, so this is not looking too bad. And then after I started improving, my skin temperature actually decreased quite a lot. And on the bottom here, there's my resting heart rate. And we also see that this increased exactly the same night, indicating there was really something off with my body that night. And the Apple Watch was able to detect this. So if you dig into these metrics yourself, you might be able to see that something is off. The main downside of Apple Watches compared to competitors when it comes to health tracking is that the Apple Health app is not that great at showing you your trends and deviations. Whereas for instance Aura and also the Whoop strap provide you with your daily health metrics at a glance, you really have to dig into the metrics in the health app yourself. But before getting to my conclusions, I also have to note that there might be more uses for the temperature sensor. For women, the temperature sensor might for instance be a good way of tracking their cycle, but of course I wasn't able to test this myself. Now overall, in terms of health and sports tracking, the Apple Watch Series 8 is really one of the most accurate devices currently on the market. But honestly, all recent Apple Watches are very good. As we saw by digging through all the data, though there are some moments with missing heart rate measurements, overall the Apple Watch 8 is still amazing at tracking your heart rate from your wrist, and its sleep tracking is also top-notch. Plus, you can count on its GPS tracking and oxygen saturation measurements to be pretty reliable. Finally, it even has some other health tracking features now, though the visualization in the app still needs to be improved. Therefore, I give the overall accuracy of the health and sports tracking metrics of the Apple Watch Series 8 4.5 out of 5 stars. For me, there are three main downsides to the Apple Watch Series 8. Now, I already mentioned the data presentation, but in addition, the main issues are the price and the battery life. If you mainly want to track your day-to-day health and sleep quality, the Oura Ring and Whoop strap are likely better choices. Now, even though their measurements might be somewhat less accurate, the data presentation and processing is just much better. They also have much better battery life, which is another issue with the Apple Watch 8. You basically need to charge it every day, which might be an issue for some people. Then finally, there's one more issue, the price. Even though it's not as expensive as the Apple Watch Ultra, the Apple Watch Series 8 will still set you back at least $400. Yes, it does have some more functionalities than the Apple Watch SE, but for most people the Apple Watch SE is probably good enough, and the SE is just over half the price at $250. Now, if you do need the oxygen saturation sensor or skin temperature sensor, or just want a bigger and better screen, you could upgrade from the SE to the Series 8. However, I would suggest you take a moment to consider if you actually need the Apple Watch 8 over the SE. Oh, and there's one more thing to keep in mind about Apple Watches. They're only compatible with iPhones, so if you rock an Android, you won't be able to use one. All of that being said, Apple Watches are still the best when it comes to measuring your sports and health metrics. So if you've already got an iPhone, I say go for it. Now, if you want to buy an Apple Watch, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, and at the same time you want to support the channel, there are different affiliate links in the description below. They do not cost you any extra, and some even provide a discount. Now, if you want to know more about some other Apple Watches, the Apple Watch Ultra and the Apple Watch SE, which are some of my favorite devices, I discuss them in more detail in these videos right here. Or if you're more interested in health tracking, check out these videos on the Oura Ring and the Whoop strap. Now, thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.